The vampire king had the whole kingdom bowing before him, except the one woman he truly desired. The marble halls of Ravencrest Castle echoed with the sound of thousands bowing in unison. King Dimitri stood on his throne, draped in black silk that seemed to absorb the candlelight around him. 500 years of immortality had taught him many things: how to rule with an iron fist, how to command respect through fear, and how to watch civilizations crumble to dust beneath his feet. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for her. She walked into the throne room with the confidence of someone who genuinely believed they had business there. Not the nervous shuffle of his courtiers, not the careful, measured steps of his generals. She simply walked, her boots clicking against the stone floor with a rhythm that somehow managed to irritate and intrigue him simultaneously. "You sent for me, Your Majesty." Her voice was steady, almost bored if Dimitri was being honest. The room held its breath. Around them, 300 nobles and dignitaries waited to see how the king would respond to such casual disrespect. Dimitri had turned men to ash for less insolence. He had watched kingdoms crumble at his word, and yet he found himself studying her face instead of ordering her execution. She was perhaps 30 years old, with sharp features that suggested a life lived outdoors rather than in drawing rooms. Her dark hair was pulled back practically, and her clothing, while fine, bore the unmistakable marks of someone who actually worked in them rather than simply wore them for show. But it was her eyes that caught him, grey as storm clouds, and utterly unimpressed by his immortal magnificence. "I did," Dimitri said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You are the new physician I've heard so much about." "Dr. Cassandra Winter," she confirmed, not bothering with the elaborate curtsy the moment seemed to demand. "Your secretary mentioned you had been having trouble sleeping. Night terrors, I believe." A collective gasp rippled through the throne room. Dimitri's eyes flashed red for just a moment, a dangerous sign that his more experienced courtiers recognized immediately. Several nobles took a step back, but Cassandra simply folded her arms and waited, as if asking about royal medical conditions was the most natural thing in the world. "My private physician has already," Dimitri began, his tone dangerous. "Your private physician," Cassandra interrupted, "has been prescribing you tinctures of belladonna mixed with opium. That's not treatment, that's slow poisoning. No wonder you can't sleep properly. Your body's in constant rebellion against toxins." Dimitri rose from his throne. The movement alone sent a shockwave through the room. Several courtiers actually fell to their knees, anticipating violence. The chandeliers flickered, but Cassandra simply stood there, meeting his gaze with an expression that suggested she was waiting for him to make a decision about something as mundane as what to eat for dinner. "You dare lecture me on my own care?" he asked, his voice soft, dangerous, the most dangerous version of his voice. "I dare suggest that a 500-year-old vampire is more likely to survive my honesty than your current physician's poison," she replied evenly. "So yes, I dare." There was a long moment, the kind of moment that in the old days had preceded kingdoms falling and armies burning. Then, against every instinct his courtiers had learned to expect from their king, Dimitri smiled. "Leave us," he commanded the room, "all of you." The exodus that followed was almost comical in its haste. Within minutes, only Dimitri and Cassandra remained in the throne room, surrounded by shadows and the weight of centuries. "You're either the bravest human I've ever met," Dimitri said, descending the stairs from his throne, "or the most foolish." "Probably both," Cassandra said. "The qualities tend to overlap." He circled her like a predator evaluating prey, but there was something in his movements that suggested he'd already decided not to eat her. At least not tonight. "What do you want, Dr. Winter?" "To do my job," she said simply. "To heal you, though I suspect healing isn't really what this is about, is it? You didn't summon the kingdom's most stubborn physician because of insomnia." Dimitri stopped circling. "And what makes you think that?" "Because a vampire king who survived 5 centuries doesn't suddenly develop medical problems that matter enough to bring in outside help. There's something else, something you want, and you think I can provide it or know something about it." She turned to face him directly. "The question is, what?" For the first time in centuries, Dimitri felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Curiosity, not the kind that drove scientific advancement or strategic thinking, the kind that made you want to know what someone thought, what someone felt, what someone wanted. "Rest," he said finally. "I want to rest, Dr. Winter. Is that so difficult to believe?" "Completely," she said, "but I'll pretend to believe it because the pay your secretary quoted is absurd enough that I'll work for you even if you're lying. When do I start?" "Tonight," Dmitri said. "Your chambers are in the East Tower. You'll have access to my personal quarters to observe my sleep patterns." She nodded, as if this arrangement wasn't wildly inappropriate by every standard of propriety. "I'll need your medical history, everything your previous physician prescribed, and your sleep schedule for the past month." "Of course," Dmitri said, already turning back toward his throne. "Welcome to Ravencrest, Dr. Winter. Try not to be murdered by the guards. They're still adjusting to the concept of assassination attempts being frowned upon." As she left the throne room, walking with the same confident stride she'd entered with, Dmitri found himself watching her go. His courtiers would say he was besotted. His advisors would say he was compromised. His enemies would say he'd finally shown weakness. None of them would understand that Cassandra Winter wasn't weakness. She was something far more dangerous. She was a problem he couldn't solve with power, couldn't intimidate with immortality, and couldn't simply command into obedience. She was, in fact, a first. And Dmitri, despite 500 years of experience, had absolutely no idea what to do with that. The East Tower felt like a fortress within a fortress. Cassandra's chambers were luxurious in that cold, impersonal way that screamed money but no actual thought. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out every trace of moonlight. The furniture was period-perfect medieval, which meant it was approximately as comfortable as sitting on a stone. The view, had she bothered to open the curtains, would have shown nothing but rocky cliffs and the occasional lost goat. She'd been at Ravencrest for 5 days now. In that time, she'd completely dismantled Dimitri's previous medical regimen, reorganized his sleep schedule, and discovered something deeply, fundamentally wrong that went far beyond insomnia or night terrors. "Your blood pressure is stable," she said, reviewing her notes as Dmitri sat in her makeshift clinic, actually his private library which she'd converted into a working space with ruthless efficiency. "Your heart rate is normal. Reflexes are sharp. Physical health, as far as I can tell, is perfect, which is weird because you're a vampire and I expected at least some kind of physiological quirk I could catalogue." Dmitri was reading a book, something in French that looked old enough to have been written when French still made sense, and didn't look up. "Is there a question buried in that observation, or are you simply thinking aloud at me?" "The night terrors," she said, moving to sit across from him uninvited. They'd fallen into this rhythm. She did things no one was supposed to do, and he'd stopped being surprised by it somewhere around day 3. "You described them as dreams where you're drowning, falling, losing control. Classic anxiety nightmares, except you're a vampire who survived 500 years through war, plague, and what I assume was at least one romantic mishap." Dmitri turned a page. "Are you going somewhere with this?" "Your previous physician's notes mention that the nightmares started about 3 months ago. They've been getting worse. You've been getting less sleep. Your appetite has decreased. I noticed you barely touched dinner, and vampires are supposed to require, well, quite a bit of sustenance if the courtier's whispered conversations are accurate." He finally looked up and she saw something flicker in his expression. Irritation, maybe, or recognition. "You've been gossiping with my staff." "I've been doing my job, which is treating your symptoms by understanding their source, and everything points to one conclusion." She leaned forward slightly. "You're not sick, Your Majesty, you're depressed." The book snapped shut with enough force to send a small wind through the library. "That is not possible." "It's absolutely possible. Depression doesn't care about your species, your power level, or your immortality. It's an equal opportunity destroyer. And you have all the markers: loss of appetite, sleep disruption, social withdrawal, general sense of despair that you're trying very hard to hide beneath layers of dramatic throne-sitting. I've ruled this kingdom for 500 years without showing weakness." "To people who are terrified of you," Cassandra interrupted, "which is a great survival strategy but a terrible coping mechanism. So I'm asking again, what happened 3 months ago?" Dmitri stood abruptly and walked to the window. The heavy curtains didn't budge under his push. He'd apparently inherited poor drapery skills from his decorator. He stared out at the darkness for a long moment. There was a kingdom, he said finally, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. To the south, small, inconsequential, they had a trade dispute with my northern territories. I sent an emissary to negotiate. Cassandra waited. This was the part where most people wanted silence, space, the illusion that their secrets weren't being heard, even though someone was clearly listening. She negotiated well, he continued, better than my generals expected. She had a solution that benefited both kingdoms without requiring bloodshed, without requiring my intervention at all. I was, he paused, searching for the word, impressed. What was her name? Cassandra asked carefully. That's not relevant. It absolutely is relevant, and you know it. Dmitri turned from the window, and in the lamplight she saw something she hadn't expected to see on the face of the immortal vampire king of Ravencrest: vulnerability. Raw, genuine, completely defenseless vulnerability. Margot, he said quietly. Her name was Margot. She was brilliant and capable and completely unimpressed by me, which I realize is apparently my type, given my current situation. What happened? Cassandra asked, keeping her voice steady. I requested she stay at court. Temporary position, I said, strategic consultant. She agreed, and for 3 months. He paused, and Cassandra watched him fight against emotion with the intensity of someone physically wrestling a demon. For 3 months I was happy. I was something I haven't been in 500 years. I was content. I felt like there might be a reason to continue existing beyond pure immortal stubbornness. And then her kingdom called her back. A disease, a crisis, something that required her specific expertise. She left. He turned back to the window. She sent a letter saying she would return when the crisis passed. That was 2.5 months ago. I've had scouts checking the southern roads. Her kingdom is fine. She's fine. She simply hasn't come back. Cassandra felt something settle in her chest. It was a feeling she recognized from her years as a physician, the understanding that sometimes the disease isn't something you can fix with medicine. Sometimes it's something far more complicated. You love her, she said quietly. I don't know if that's relevant, he replied, though his tone suggested he absolutely thought it was. But since you've apparently decided that my personal life is now part of the medical examination, yes. I've spent 500 years isolated by my own power, afraid of what I might do, what I might become. And then she came, and for the first time I wasn't afraid. I was just content. And now I spend every night wondering if she's thought about me at all, or if I was simply a fascinating distraction to her. So the night terrors are me falling, he said bitterly, falling from the one moment in 500 years when I felt like I wasn't completely alone. Every night I dream of losing her, and every morning I wake up knowing I already have. Cassandra sat with that for a moment. The books around them seemed to absorb the weight of his confession. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows with the sound of something trying to get in, or perhaps something trying to get out. You should go to her, Cassandra said finally. She didn't ask me to. She also didn't ask you not to. There's a difference between someone saying they'll come back and someone saying they never want to see you again. The fact that she's taken months instead of weeks suggests, to me, that maybe she's dealing with something complicated. But that doesn't mean she doesn't want you there. Dmitri turned to look at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. You're very invested in someone you've never met. I'm invested in my patient's health, she corrected, but there was something in her tone that suggested it might be more than that. And my patient's health is inextricably tied to someone else's return. So I'm suggesting a treatment plan. Go, find her, talk to her, resolve this in whatever way needs resolving. And if she turns me away, then you come back here, we continue treatment, and you work on processing rejection in a healthy way instead of letting it destroy you from the inside out. She smiled slightly, but I don't think she will. That night Dmitri made preparations to travel south. Cassandra helped him plan a route that would arrive at Margot's kingdom under the cover of darkness, which seemed appropriate somehow. As she watched him gather things in his chambers, clothes he'd worn 5 centuries ago, books he'd been meaning to read with someone, a letter he'd started writing and never sent, she felt something strange. It felt almost like disappointment, which was ridiculous. She'd known for 5 days that he was in love with someone else. That was the entire problem they were solving. And yet, as she watched him prepare to leave Ravencrest to find someone else, she couldn't quite shake the feeling that she'd made a terrible mistake. He came back exactly 11 days later. Cassandra was in the library reviewing medical texts when she heard the commotion in the courtyard, the sounds of horses, of guards scrambling, of servants running. She didn't go to the window. She already knew who it would be. She'd been tracking the days obsessively, calculating travel time, imagining scenarios that ranged from romantic reunion to complete rejection. When Dimitri entered the library, he looked exactly as she'd feared, devastated. He didn't say anything. He simply moved to the shelves and started pulling books down with mechanical precision, old leather-bound volumes that looked like they'd been touched by the same hands 500 years ago. His movements were careful, deliberate, and utterly expressionless, the face of someone trying very hard not to feel anything at all. "It didn't go well," Cassandra said. "It wasn't a question." "She was happy," Dimitri said, his voice completely flat. "That's the worst part. She was happy and she built a wonderful life without me, and she clearly doesn't need me to maintain that happiness. When I appeared at her door in the middle of the night, which in retrospect was a terrible strategy, she was kind about it. Very kind, actually. She explained that she cares about me, but she also has responsibilities, and a romance with an immortal vampire king was a beautiful episode in her life, not the foundation of it." He pulled down another book. This one seemed to be poetry, which Cassandra found somehow more depressing. "She said the loneliness of immortality isn't something she can bear," he continued. "That watching me never age, never change, never be anything but what I am would slowly destroy her. She said I deserve someone who understands that world, someone who shares that burden, someone immortal." Cassandra felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Did you tell her about your night terrors, about how you've been suffering?" "Of course I did," he said bitterly. "I've apparently learned nothing about emotional manipulation in 500 years, so I thought showing her my pain would somehow convince her that she was wrong to leave." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "It didn't. She just looked sad and told me I needed to find someone else, someone who could truly understand." He sank into one of the library chairs, and for the first time Cassandra saw the king look genuinely old. Not ancient. He was beyond that somehow, which made it worse, but depleted, like the concept of years had finally caught up with him in a way immortality never could. "I'm sorry," Cassandra said quietly. "I shouldn't have pushed you to go, I didn't know." "No," he interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made her stop. "You were right, I needed to know. I needed to hear it from her instead of spending the rest of eternity wondering what if. That's what immortality does. It stretches out all your regrets until they're practically infinite. At least now I have an answer." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his eyes were empty. "I think I'd like to be alone now, Dr. Winter, unless there are any other traumatic life decisions you'd like to push me toward for the sake of my mental health." Cassandra stood. "I'll leave you, but Dimitri—" "Your Majesty," he corrected, his voice cold. "We're returning to formality now, I think. The therapeutic intimacy is over." She left the library, but the coldness in his voice followed her all the way back to the East Tower. She spent the night staring at the ceiling, reviewing the events of the past weeks, and trying to understand when exactly she'd started hoping that his romantic quest would fail. It was a thought pattern that required medication she didn't have access to. The next morning brought unexpected news. Cassandra was eating breakfast in her chambers when one of the castle servants appeared with a message that made her blood run cold. "The king has taken ill," the servant said, clearly uncomfortable delivering this information. "He's requested your presence in his chambers immediately." She found him in bed, which was so contrary to everything she'd learned about him that it took her a moment to process. The vampire king, legendary for his strength, was lying in his bed like an invalid, and as she moved closer, she understood why. His skin was grey, not the pale white of typical vampire complexion, but the sickly grey of something dying. His breathing was shallow, and when his eyes opened to look at her, they were barely red, mostly just the dark brown of the human beneath, exhausted and fading. "What did you do?" she demanded, moving to check his vital signs with trembling hands. "Nothing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I simply stopped." "Stopped what?" "Everything, feeding, healing, caring. The body of a vampire, Dr. Winter, is sustained by will as much as blood. We're supernatural creatures because we decide to be, and I find I've stopped deciding. Cassandra felt cold horror slide through her veins. You're dying, you're choosing to die. Yes, he said simply. Is that medically fascinating at least? Should I feel honored that my deterioration is scientifically noteworthy? No, she said fiercely, and suddenly her entire professional composure cracked. No, absolutely not. This is not happening. You don't get to give up. You don't get to decide that because one person didn't want forever with you, forever isn't worth having. Why do you care? He asked, and there was genuine confusion in his voice. You barely know me. A few weeks ago I was just a patient with insomnia. Because, Cassandra said, and then she stopped. Because she realized in that moment that she couldn't answer that question truthfully without revealing something she'd been trying very hard not to admit. She sat on the edge of his bed and took his hand. It was cold, wrong. A hand that should have been powerful felt like paper and air. Because, she said finally, I'm a doctor, and I don't give up on patients. It was technically a lie, but it was the only lie either of them could afford right now. Over the next 3 days, Cassandra fought harder than she'd ever fought in her medical career. She brought him back from the brink through sheer force of will, refusing to let him fade, refusing to allow despair to complete its work. She sat by his bed and talked about everything, her childhood, her parents, her reasons for becoming a physician. She told him stories about medical disasters she'd survived, difficult patients she'd helped, the strange joy of knowing you'd made a difference in someone's life. And slowly, incrementally, the Vampire King began to fight back. His color returned. His breathing deepened. By the 4th day, he could sit up. By the 5th, he was arguing with her about whether he needed medical supervision anymore. On the 6th day, as she was preparing to leave his chambers, he spoke the words that changed everything. I know why you really stayed, he said quietly. I've had time to think, to review those first 5 days before I left for Margot's kingdom. The way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching. The way you listened when I talked about her, even though it must have hurt. Cassandra's hand froze on the door handle. Your Majesty. You love me, he said simply. You have for weeks. And you were willing to watch me leave, willing to help me find happiness with someone else because you thought that's what would save me. She couldn't turn around. If she turned around and looked at him, everything would fall apart. That's a very romantic diagnosis, she said carefully, but it's not relevant to your treatment plan. Isn't it? He asked. Because I've realized something while lying in this bed. I was wrong about immortality. I thought what made it unbearable was loving someone who wouldn't love me back forever, but what actually makes it unbearable is refusing to love someone who's right here because I'm afraid of repeating a mistake. She felt his presence before she heard him move. He was standing behind her now, and she could sense him breathing, actual deep breathing, the breathing of someone who'd chosen to live. You were the answer, Cassandra, he said quietly. Not Margot, not someone immortal who would understand my curse. You, someone willing to stand in my throne room and tell me I was being poisoned. Someone willing to push me toward my own heartbreak so I could learn. Someone willing to sit by my bed and save my life by refusing to let me die. She turned then because she couldn't stop herself from turning. He looked alive again, truly, vitally alive, and he was looking at her with an expression that made her understand why his entire kingdom bowed before him. It had nothing to do with fear. I can't give you forever, she said because she needed him to understand. I'm human, I'll age, I'll die, and you'll still be here. I know, he said, and we'll deal with that when it comes. Maybe you'll decide you want to become what I am. Maybe you'll refuse and I'll have the privilege of loving you for the finite years we're given, but at least we'll have the choice. At least we'll have this. He reached out and took her hand, and for the first time since the moment she'd walked into his throne room, Cassandra felt like maybe everything had been building to this exact moment. I'm still your physician, she said, though it sounded weak even to her own ears. No, he said softly, I think you're done treating me now. He kissed her then, and the throne room's marble halls might have been cold, but in that moment, in that private chamber, everything felt remarkably warm. 3 months after kissing in his private chamber, everything changed. Cassandra was in the laboratory, the one she'd set up in the castle's south wing, reviewing blood work when she found it. A small inconsistency in Dimitri's cellular structure, something that shouldn't have been there, something that shouldn't have been possible. She ran the test again, then a third time, then she sat down on a stool and tried very hard not to panic. The door opened behind her. She'd learned to recognize his footsteps, the particular weight of him, the specific way he moved through the world like he already owned it. "You're avoiding the state dinner," he said, coming to stand behind her. "The southern ambassadors are here, and apparently I need your company to look less threatening. Apparently happiness makes me less frightening. Who knew?" "Dimitri, we need to talk," she said, and something in her tone made his entire demeanor shift. He came around to look at the test results, his brow furrowing. "What am I looking at?" "Your blood work," she said. "The cellular markers I've been tracking for the past 3 months. They're changing." "Changing how?" "I don't have a good explanation," she admitted, which was harder than it should have been. "But based on everything I know about vampire physiology, which admittedly isn't much, I think your body is beginning to acclimate." He stared at the results. "Acclimate to what?" "To me," she said quietly. Dimitri, I think your body is making me your bloodline. I think you're slowly turning me into a vampire without actually performing the ritual." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that could break buildings. "That's not possible," he said finally. "I didn't think it was either, but your cells have been interacting with mine for months. Intimate contact has consequences for vampires that humans don't anticipate, and I think your body decided that keeping me human was less important than keeping me." He sat down, which was unlike him. Dimitri didn't sit down in laboratories. He commanded from doorways and watched from shadows. The fact that he needed to sit down suggested something was genuinely wrong. "How long?" he asked. "If my calculations are right, a year, maybe 2. By then the transformation will be complete. You'll wake up one morning and I'll be immortal." She watched him process this, watched his expressions cycle through denial, anger, fear, and finally, something that looked almost like relief before he caught himself and buried it under something more controlled. "You're going to leave," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I haven't decided yet," Cassandra admitted. "Part of me wants to, the part that's terrified of losing my humanity. But another part, the part that's been in love with you for months, which I'm still not happy about, by the way, is wondering if maybe this is the universe solving a problem we were too stubborn to solve ourselves." "This isn't the universe solving anything," he said bitterly. "This is me contaminating you. This is me turning you into what I am without your consent." "Did I not give you consent?" she asked carefully. "Dimitri, I knew what I was doing. I understood the risks. I chose this." "You didn't choose immortality. You chose me. They're not the same thing." "Maybe not," she agreed, "but I'm choosing to believe they could be." He stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the castle grounds were sprawling and beautiful. 500 years of careful cultivation had created something that looked more like a palace than a fortress. "I've spent 500 years alone," he said quietly, "and I was just getting used to the idea of loving someone who would eventually leave me, someone whose finite existence would give our time meaning, someone who would give me permission to eventually move on." "You want to lose me," Cassandra said, understanding dawning. "Not because you don't love me, but because you think I deserve an end." "You deserve to be human," he said fiercely, turning to face her. "You deserve a normal life, a career you don't have to abandon, the option to have children, the option to make choices about your own existence without having my immortal biology making decisions for you." "I also deserve to choose," she said, standing to face him properly. "And I'm choosing this, I'm choosing you, even if it makes me immortal, even if it changes everything about who I am, because I've already changed, Dimitri. You changed me the moment you stopped being a king and started being a person in front of me." "This is a mistake," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Probably," she agreed, "definitely actually, but it's our mistake to make together." The state dinner that night was the most tense event Ravencrest had hosted in living memory. The southern ambassadors kept asking if something was wrong with the king, who seemed distracted. The court wondered if the famous romance was already cracking. The servants gossiped about the young physician who'd captured the Vampire King's heart, and whether she might have poisoned him after all. None of them understood that they were watching two immortal beings, one who'd always been immortal, one who was becoming it, grappling with the question of whether forever was a gift or a curse. That night, after the dinner had dissolved and the castle had settled into sleep, Cassandra found Dmitri in his library. He was reading by candlelight, which seemed appropriate somehow. A 500-year-old vampire, still learning how to live in the present tense. "I've made a decision," he said, not looking up from his book, "about your transformation." She waited. "I'm going to fight it," he said. "I'm going to make it take as long as possible. I'm going to practice every technique I learned over 5 centuries for controlling my nature. I'm going to give you every year, every day, every moment that I possibly can of being human." "And then," she asked, "and then when it happens, we'll deal with it, together, the way we deal with everything else." She smiled and sat beside him. "You know this is going to be complicated, right? The entire kingdom knowing you're in love with someone, the political implications, the moral questions about whether an immortal being should be allowed to create new immortals." "I know," he said. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were the red of a vampire at peace with what he was. "But I've spent 500 years making everything look perfect from a throne. Maybe it's time I spent some years learning how to be imperfect on equal footing with someone else." "That's disgustingly romantic," Cassandra said. "I'm a vampire king. We're kind of known for it." Over the next 2 years, everything changed. The kingdom adjusted to having a queen who was technically still human, but who clearly had one foot already in the immortal world. She continued her medical work, but now she was healing the entire kingdom, breaking down barriers between the vampire court and the human population that had existed for centuries. Dmitri, to everyone's surprise, became less dramatic, still powerful, still commanding, but tempered by someone who wasn't afraid to tell him when he was being ridiculous. The night terrors stopped. The loneliness faded. For the first time in 500 years, he had someone who understood both his power and his vulnerability. The transformation, when it finally came, happened on a winter night almost exactly 2 years after Cassandra had discovered the first cellular changes. She woke up and could see in the dark. She felt strong in a way that transcended muscle and bone. She understood, suddenly, the weight of immortality and the strange gift of it. Dmitri was waiting for her when she emerged from their chambers, fully aware of what she'd become. "Hello," he said softly. "Welcome to forever." "Is it horrible?" she asked. "Ask me in 500 years," he replied. "Right now it's just you and me in a castle at dawn. I'm willing to call that perfect." The vampire king, who'd had the whole kingdom bowing before him, stood before his new vampire queen, and for the first time the power dynamic was truly equal. She reached out and took his hand. "Together?" she asked. "Always," he replied. And in that moment, with the first light of morning breaking through the castle windows, the vampire king, who had once ruled alone, found something he'd been searching for in 500 years of immortality. He found home. The only way a 500-year-old vampire king could ever truly be conquered was by someone brave enough to stand before his throne and refuse to kneel. If you want extended stories, join my Patreon and get extended stories, exclusive character backstories, writing tips and creative guidance, direct access to Ask Me Anything, early access to new releases. Your support isn't just a subscription, it's becoming part of a complete storytelling universe. Start your journey at Patreon, link is in description.